Oh, I see. I feel like I knew that already. Awesome. So are you a victim of any of these crazy weather conditions that are happening right now?
Well, it's pretty nuts right now. It's about 4 degrees here, I think,
Oh my God.
4 or 5, something like that. It was actually warmer in Philadelphia where I left this morning than it is here when I get back. So it's a little strange.
Gee.
But
I won't tell you what the weather's like here because you'll probably hate me for the rest of the interview. So
I'm sure it's quite a bit different.
quite a bit
So
different. So I,
yes, I have all my January and February speeches for the most part are in cold area. I do come to Southern California in a couple of weeks, but everything else is freezing.
that's awesome. I'm excited to hear that you're coming to Southern California. I didn't know that. So where are you going to be?
I'm going to be at a couple different places. Going to be at well, let me look at my thing real quick, and I'll tell you exactly. My calendar. Where am I? Oh, I'm going to be in. Well, wait, where'd it go? It was right there, and now it's gone. Oh, let's see. Well, I'm going to be at Marlboro School, which is like a prep school, and
Yeah.
Grossmont, which I guess is a college, and then Cleveland High School, which is out in Reseda. I go there
Wow.
every year, basically. So Marlboro's LA, Grossmont is somewhere around LA, and no, I think Grossmont's in San Diego actually.
Yeah, yeah, this is
Go to,
definitely
yeah, go to Grossmont in San Diego, Marlboro in LA, and then Cleveland High School in Reseda.
awesome. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started because I know people are watching right now. This is actually broadcasting live on my YouTube channel. So
They,
yeah, so folks can see me and hear you. So I've been following your work for some time now. My background actually, my undergrad's in engineering, but I got a poli-sci master's a couple years ago, and after I graduated, I was going to teach a black politics class. And when I started researching, I found like all this information. It was like overload, and I found that's when I kind of discovered you. I know that you've talked a lot about, you've had a lot of speeches, a lot of conferences, a lot of roundtables and debates. I've watched a lot of Tim Wise on YouTube. I've seen you argue for affirmative action. I've seen you argue against color blindness. So needless to say, you are kind of a preeminent voice when it comes to equality and anti-racism. So this interview is really about, it's a series I'm doing called Preaching to the Choir. And it's about black activists in particular and how we spend the majority of our time preaching to other black people and people who think like us and look like us. But we rarely allow other voices in to that schema. We rarely allow other voices who don't necessarily look like us, kind of, I'm saying, guest pastor for a Sunday, you know? So it's funny because someone recently described this to me as like water is wet. You know, we talk to people about the things that we know, and it's usually things that they know as well. So I wanted to give others an opportunity to kind of voice the same discussion, to talk about advocating for anti-racism and racial equality, but not necessarily being the person to give the message. So I know you've written 6 books. You've written Dear White America, White Like Me, The People Rock in a Hard Place. I'm reading right now Colorblind. So I want to talk to you specifically about the term colorblind and the term post-racial and how they've really kind of saturated the mainstream when we talk about race dialogue. I know what your stance is on those, but my question for you is, what word would you choose if you could discuss the state of racial equality right now? I'm sure you wouldn't choose colorblind or post-racial, but what word would you actually choose and why?
I don't think I would. I don't think I would settle on a particular word or a phrase. I think the reason is that that's sort of what our culture does to simplify and oversimplify problems and issues. So we pick names for different ages and different eras and different decades, and so we think of, for instance, we think of the '60s as the civil rights era, and so
Right.
people use the phrase now, the post-civil rights era. Of course, that's a problem because we're not really post-civil rights.
Right.
Civil rights are constantly under attack, and so I tend to avoid those kind of phrases. I think I would sum up the current period by saying that we are in an era of perhaps racism 2.0, but with a heavy dose of ongoing racism 1.0, or old school racism still, very much in effect. And of course, racism interpersonal level are certainly more likely than perhaps ever before to have some kind of connection to maybe even a friendship with or relationship with someone who is a person of color, or to in some way, have great respect for certain individual peoples of color in the society, but that they tend to view them as exceptions, negative rule. And so when you're carving out exceptions for this black person or that Asian person or that Latino, whether that exception is Barack Obama, whether it's Cliff Huxtable in a fictional sense, whether it's someone who's an athlete or an entertainment icon,
right.
But you still view the community from which they come in a negative way, then that's just sort of a shape-shifted type of racism. So if I had to choose a phrase, I could choose that one, but even that would be too simple, because it would ignore that the bigger issue is the ongoing institutional inequality that manifests in every area of American life, whether we're talking about wealth, income, education, criminal justice system, housing, all of this.
Right, right. So many of my readers are people of color. And I mean, I have some that are not, but they would be the minority in terms of my readers. So I wanted to ask you specifically about this arena that you're in, because I would imagine that in most scenarios, you would be a minority. As a white male in these discussions, you'd be a minority. So can you discuss some of the feedback you've received in terms of advocating for issues that affect mainly people of color?
Well, it's sort of interesting, because on the one hand, even though white men are certainly not, proportionately represented in these discussions,
right,
part because we've chosen not to be there.
Right.
That's really why. It's certainly not because we've been excluded from them. Really, it's because we've opted out. I think white folks generally have opted out, and white men especially done so. But even when that's true, I have to say it's not much of a minority experience as I would imagine it is for people of color in mostly white spaces, because even when a white man finds himself in the numerical minority in a particular place, it's not as if the power dynamics have really been flipped on their head and that white person is experiencing true marginality. In fact, let's be perfectly honest, and I've written about this and talked about it often, if anything, my voice is amplified unfairly and unjustly, precisely because I'm white and male. And so even though I think it's important for white men, myself included, to work and to try to be as strong an ally as we can be to the people of color who do by necessity lead this discussion and lead this work, we also have to recognize that we're still given an outsized influence on the larger discussion. And it's not just with what I do now. I mean, I can remember, when I was a community organizer in the mid-90s in New Orleans, I was an organizer in public housing projects in that city. And when I would be in the community, there would be very few, if any, other white folks around. So I was certainly outnumbered. And yet even there, I still had, I might have been a minority numerically, but I wasn't minoritized in terms of power, because the folks in that community, if they didn't know who I was, they tended to assume that I was either a cop or a social worker. Either of those cases, I had power. If they acted any way crazy around me, I could either arrest them or take their kids away from them. Would be the thing they might think when they see a white person in that community. So, it is true that a lot of times I find myself in a numerical minority, but being white still certainly provides this sort of armor of power that I have to be aware of, and that other whites who do the work should be aware of as well.
Right, and I it's so funny you say that, because another person in this series, her name is Olivia Cole. She writes for Huffington Post. She's a great poet and author, and she's a social activist, and she's a white female living in Chicago. And she said the same thing. She said, in a lot of cases, I feel like I should be a curator. I should be kind of on the sidelines looking in, as opposed to in the center of the conversation, because I would prefer that people of color lead the conversation and that I just kind of be involved. And I thought that was really interesting, to be a social activist by curation. And I think what you're saying is actually true, that people like Olivia Cole, people like Tim Wise, you do kind of have a megaphone. And it's precisely because it's easier to hear the message from someone who looks like you. And I think that white people are more comfortable hearing these messages from white people. Would you agree, or do you think that it's something else having to do with white privilege, or is it just because the message is more salient that way?
Well, there's a couple things going on. I mean, I think on the one hand, certainly, the dominant group members have an easier time hearing just about anything from other dominant group members. I don't have any doubt about that. So there's that sort of embedded privilege in the fact that white folks have really been trained away from listening to people of color, just like men have been trained away from listening to women talk about sexism and patriarchy. And I would imagine any marginalized group is unfortunately not heard as well by the dominant group. But there's also another dynamic that can happen, and I think this is also very interesting, which is there's a real sharp divide in the kind of response that white folks have to other white folks who do this work, right? So there's, on the one hand, the exaggerated legitimacy that is given to us that ought to be given to anyone who speaks about the issue truthfully, but unfortunately sometimes is not extended to people of color. So there's that, which we've been talking about. Then there's another response, which is sort of the how dare you tell these facts. So there are those white folks who will respond especially viciously for white folks who do this. It's sort of like, how dare you give away the handshake of the secret club. And so there's not a lot of in between, which is sort of a weird thing, right? When you're doing the work, you've got one group of people who are just like, have been so oblivious to this and have ignored people of color for years, and all of a sudden they hear it from you and they go, oh my God, that's so brilliant. You have to remind them that it wasn't your brilliance. Stuff that black and brown folks have said forever. And then you've got the other people who are like, yeah, by the way, we're going to blow up your house.
Oh my gosh.
That kind of thing. So it's a weird sort of world to be in. There's that exaggerated legitimacy and that sort of you're a race traitor kind of response. And I think that probably is true in other dynamics. I know that sometimes men get really, really angry at other men. They call them on sexism. We know they get angry at women who do it, but man, they just get really vicious with other guys who do it, because there's almost this sense of
camaraderie.
If that guy is calling out sexism and I'm a guy and I'm doing sexism, why am I doing that? Why am I not more like him? Kind of thing. And I think Ray's the same way. If a white person challenges another white person, it sort of blows up their assumption that they can get away with it, and it makes them start to question, why it is that they're not on the same page as the anti-racists, which I think is ultimately a good thing, obviously, to get people questioning, but it can provoke some very interesting and sometimes very over-the-top responses.
Right. So the sentiment that I'm getting while doing this series is that you can't really change a really racist person's mind. I mean, at one interview, he actually said, maybe we should all go live on an asteroid and have like our own little brown planet intergalactically so we can just avoid the race problem. And I want to know what you think. I mean, do you think that we're fighting the good fight and that we're changing minds, that by being activists, we're actually changing something? Or are we kind of just, the people who are willing to listen are the ones who are going to get it, but the people who are really racist are just never going to change?
Well, I assume that most people who are really heavily invested in their racism for whatever psychological or material reason probably aren't going to change. That doesn't mean they can't, but it does mean that they're probably not going to because of something I say or you say, or it's not like they're going to read a book or an article or hear a speech or a radio show and all of a sudden go, oh my God, I've been wrong my whole life. Like that's not normally how it works, right? Normally how it works for those kind of people is that they have some epiphany, some emotional crisis in their life, something, their little sort of come to Jesus moment that you can't really provide for them. It's just one of those things that sometimes happens. But I always advise people who are activists, don't spend a lot of time trying to be the person who converts the heathen, so to speak, right? Converts the over bigoted. Even if you can get them, the amount of time you've got to put in to convert that kind of person to a more just place is probably not going to be worth it. On the other hand, I don't think that describes those people.
Right.
So in other words, yes, I don't think the hardcore racist is really convertible by normal means, but I also don't think our job is to convert those folks. I don't think that's the biggest issue because they're not the majority. The majority, I don't believe.
Right.
And I think there's quite a bit of evidence to substantiate this, are not overt bigots. Now, we know the research tells us that subconscious and implicit bias is incredibly common. 75% at least of white Americans, for instance, have been demonstrated to subconscious bias, which absolutely has an effect on the way they treat people of color. It manifests in discrimination. About 45% of African Americans, according to that same research, have internalized anti-black biases against themselves, so it works on black folks too. But the good news in that regard is that there is a pretty substantial body of research now, the last 10 years or so, which suggests that those kinds of biases that are the most common and which are sometimes really hard to get at precisely because they are not obvious biases, they are subconscious, that those are biases that if we make ourselves and others more aware of them, if we create policies and practices and procedures within our institutional spaces that force us to examine those biases and how they might be affecting our judgment, that we actually can sort of create firewalls between the bias and the discriminatory treatment. So we can actually intervene in ways that will take what is subconscious, pull it out into the conscious mind. And because most people aren't horrible bigots who are deliberately trying to harm people, when they see that they're doing that or behaving in that way, the research says that they oftentimes do better. So I think we can make impacts there. And of course we can make impacts on institutions. You know, the thing we learned in the South, interestingly, and that a lot of other parts of the country didn't, is that when the South was forced to desegregate, thankfully, our schools, when the courts left us with no choice but to do that, it was interesting that 20 years later, Southern whites were actually looked more favorably upon desegregated schooling and equitable schooling than white folks in the North or the Midwest or the West Coast, who had never actually, in most cases, been forced to do that. So in some ways, if we change institutional realities, if we change structural realities, sometimes that can help change attitudes on the back end. And I think that's what we should be focusing on. Regardless of whether we change somebody's mind or change someone's heart, if we tell cops that they can't stop and frisk and they can't racially profile, it doesn't really matter what's in their head. It matters what they're able to do to people. And if they're not allowed to do things to people without suffering real consequences, I don't think most folks probably care what they think when they're at home and, sitting around, talking to their buddies, as long as they're not able to manifest that in the way they treat people.
Agreed. So in the same vein, I often describe myself as someone who's waging a war on ignorance. I think that there's obviously varying levels of ignorance when it comes to race dialogue. Some folks are blatantly, willfully ignorant, and some people are actually clueless, right? So there's some people who just have never been around people of color, and they are getting their information from whatever TV show or cartoon they watch. Would you say that ignorance plays a primary role in a lot of the racism that we see today, or is that just an excuse? So people just say, oh, I don't know anything about black people, or I don't know about Asian people. Are they just making it up, or is it really something that has a role that we should kind of address?
An excuse for some, but a reality for others. I definitely, I meet thousands and thousands of young people every year because most of my speeches are on college campuses, and I meet young folks or come in contact with young folks who are very conscious that they just have been raised in such an unbelievably sheltered, racially isolated environment that they really don't know. They've never been around black folks, never been around Asian or Latino folks or Native peoples or whatever. And so they're really often manifesting quite a bit of ignorance. But those people, interestingly, are usually not the ones who I find go out and do really incredibly racist things. In fact, the people that are somewhat ignorant are usually the ones who will come and admit that they're ignorant, and they even, in many cases, realize that that's a problem. They realize that they don't want to be that ignorant. They don't want to be, unable to have conversations with people across lines of identity. But so the ones who I think sometimes are the most naive are not the ones that are the most dangerous. The ones who do the really racist stuff, for instance, whether it's throwing racist theme parties in their fraternity, as we've seen over and over again. This last week, in MLK Day, Arizona State, there was a fraternity that had a big
MLK black people.
They had this racist party. I don't think that they were in blackface per se, but they were certainly sort of, mocking what they perceived to be black cultural style or hip hop or whatever else. ASU, thankfully, is kicking them off campus. But those kind of kids who do that, those young adults who engage in that, I think typically are not just simply naive. So, for instance, I can't extend the simple shield of or the cover of ignorance to someone who throws a party like that on MLK Day.
Right.
You can't tell me
Right.
you didn't know it was racist when
Right.
you do it on that day. Now,
Exactly.
if you're one of those people that shows up at a Halloween party and you thought it was okay to, you know, to dress up like Jay-Z or something and,
Yeah.
and put blackface on, you might be the kind of person who is just truly ignorant about
Right.
the history of blackface, because God knows our schools don't teach about it.
Of course not.
But even then, I generally assume that, you know, given how often these blackface incidents or ghetto party incidents or all of these things happen, they happen every year,
Yep.
multiple times a year, and every time they happen, they make the news. So the idea that people didn't hear about that, the idea that people haven't heard that, you know, people of color really don't like it when you mock them,
Right.
seems absurd to me. So I think those folks, if it is ignorance, it's more of what you alluded to in the setup to that question, which is that there's true ignorance and naivete, and then there's this sort of structured, almost willed ignorance.
Right.
And I think in that sense, it's a willful kind of ignorance that still needs to be held accountable, as opposed to just being stupid.
Right.
And you know, yeah.
So you kind of alluded to current events, and I had a specific question for you about some current events. I haven't heard your opinion yet on the whole Richard Sherman thing. And
Yeah.
there was an article on Salon.com today by Beanie Barnes, and Barnes said basically that Black people exist in a damned if we do, damned if we don't space in American conversation. And if you have negative behavior, it's because, you know, that's how you are. It's inherent to you. Whereas you have someone like a Justin Bieber, right? So he's arrested now for driving under the influence, and people are standing with him and saying, "Oh, it's just a mistake." You know, no one's calling him a thug, right? No one's saying, "Oh, he's a bad kid," and he kind of gets away with this because, you know, he's America's pop icon. He's America's sweetheart, even though he's Canadian. But the whole article deals with, you know, the Richard Sherman, who is a Stanford-educated man with a master's degree, an A- average, and a salutatorian in high school, juxtaposed against, you know, folks who are white who have none of those accolades to their name, but continue to get kind of this clean slate view from the mainstream. So what's your opinion, A, on how racialized that conversation became after Richard Sherman basically was being a football player, right?
Right.
And then also your ideas about the juxtaposition when we look at other white young men who are displaying some of the same characteristics and worse, but never being labeled that way.
Well, you know, first of all, do the comparison and the contrast, because that's maybe the easiest piece. I mean, you know, taking it out of the Justin Bieber realm for just a minute, just looking at athletes.
Yeah.
I mean, what is the meaning of calling Richard Sherman a thug in the same week? He pointed this out actually in one of his statements the other day. In the very same week, when a bunch of white hockey players, literally within 2 seconds of the puck dropping at the beginning of the hockey match, just decided, you know what, let's not play hockey.
Let's just fight
the hell out of each other,
yeah.
Right? I mean, these are people actually beating each other up, and nothing's even happening. The puck is just dropped, and they're like, screw hockey.
Right.
Have a brawl, and they're not being referred to as thugs. No one is saying, this is, you know, how dare you do this in front of my children? What kind of example are you? Blah, blah, blah. They're just being hockey players.
Right.
By the same token, you want to talk about an arrogant athlete, and one who, frankly, is, I assure you, not, and I can predict this right now, is not going to have the kind of pro career that Richard Sherman is having. You know, Johnny Manziel at Texas A&M would have you believe that, you know, he is the greatest football player in the history of the game. He is arrogant. He is a jerk. He's a good quarterback. But, you know, Ryan Leaf was a really good college quarterback, too, and reasonably arrogant. And I don't know, he might be sacking groceries now. I have no idea what he's doing. I know he's not playing football. And so do people listen to Johnny Manziel and have that kind of reaction? Did they have that reaction to John McEnroe when he would mouth off to line judges, you know, at Wimbledon? No, we all sort of thought it was funny.
Right.
Got a kick out of it. Did they have that reaction to, you know, any number of white athletes over the years who have been incredibly arrogant and actually, in many cases, violent? And the answer, of course, is no. We have a very different reaction, and it is almost entirely about race and the assumptions that people have when they see a black athlete and they don't know anything about him. They assume that he is, in their estimation, a thug. They don't care where he went to college. They don't care about any of that. They don't care about the fact that that in Richard Sherman's case, you know, and now the video has been released, and he was mic'd up at the time, and he tried to congratulate Crabtree on the field, and, you know, a hand was put in his face. So he was in many ways provoked to criticize guy who he swatted the ball away from, but no
Right.
one wants to talk about that. So I think what all of this says is that we, as a society, white folks have been so primed to, on the one hand, revere athletes,
Right.
and many professional athletes, particularly in the NFL and the NBA, of course, are African American. On the one hand, there's this weird dichotomy: revering the athlete, including the black athlete, cheering for the athlete, including the black athlete, as long as they're on your team,
Right.
as long as they're on the team that you like. But at the same time, being sort of not just fascinated and revering them, but also fearing them and also viewing them as dangerous. And so there's a fascination, but also a repulsion. And I think that's a very dangerous mix, right? Because when you're fascinated with people, or when you see them being very successful, on the one hand, a very common response in this culture to that is jealousy. And if
Right.
you think someone's dangerous, your response is fear. And neither jealousy nor fear are very productive human emotions to create empathy or connection
Right.
or solidarity. So that white folks, on the one hand, can turn on a dime when an athlete who is a person of color engages in behavior that they think is somehow transgressive. And as one final example, think about Barry Bonds. When Barry Bonds was accused of and probably did use anabolic steroids
Right.
over a period of several years during the sort of steroids era of Major League Baseball. Everyone, not everyone, but an overwhelming number of white folks looked at him as a cheater, said he should never, of course, be in the Hall of Fame. There should be an asterisk next to every record he ever sets. Forgetting, apparently, that there are an awful lot of white baseball players at the very same time who are doing the same thing. They
Right.
didn't speak about Roger Clemens the same way. Now, is Roger Clemens now looked at as a cheater? Yes. But at the time, they weren't talking about him that way. They weren't thinking of him that way. And the idea, but this structural terms, the idea that Barry Bonds somehow had received an unfair edge over his competitors by way of steroids, and we should put an asterisk next to his name. I find that interesting when we don't insist that athletes like Babe Ruth and Ted Williams
Right.
and Joe DiMaggio and Lou Gehrig and Ty Cobb, who played under segregation,
Right.
but were protected from black competition,
Right.
therefore were unfairly advantaged in the baseball market. We don't put asterisks next to their names,
Great
but I'm
point.
pretty sure that segregated baseball
Might have
was
helped
a
out.
bigger performance protector and enhancer
Of
for
course.
white ball players
Of course.
than steroids were for Barry Bonds. Because
Yeah.
when Barry Bonds was using steroids, he was facing pitchers who were also on steroids.
Right.
I'm not really sure who had the better edge, but I know that when Joe DiMaggio in a game that was an exhibition game in the 30s faced Satchel Paige, he said he was the greatest pitcher he ever had to face. Of course, he never had to really face it in a real game.
Right.
And there's a reason for that. You ignore it.
I 100% agree, and I've never thought of it that way ever. And obviously, it's probably because I don't really follow baseball. But when you explain it that way, it kind of makes you question the structural factors that people are ignoring. And so much of racism is structural. I feel like you talk about racism, and people think, oh, well, I'm not being rude to black people, so there is no racism. They think of it on these individual microaggressive level, and they never really realize that racism at this point has gone on for so long. It's rooted so deeply in our culture that it's structural now. I mean, there's institutional racism that dictates the majority of the microaggressions that we experience. But yeah, I'm just glad I got to talk to you today, and everyone is really envious of me. So all of my friends are like dying right now that I'm talking to you, and they're not. And that was my last question, but I actually think I want to probably email you and keep in touch and see if I can try and meet you when you're in Southern California in the next couple of weeks.
That would be great. That would be fantastic. I'd love to chat with you again. I'm sure that that there won't be any lack of race-related news items that we can talk about.
I'm sure we'll have plenty of material.
Absolutely.
But thanks so much for talking to me and for being so responsive. And I hope you stay safe and warm in your 4-degree weather. Take care of yourself.
I will try.
But make sure you don't bring a jacket when you come to SoCal, because we're warm down here. So you won't need a winter coat.
Yeah, very good. Well, I'll try. Next time I'll try to get the Google Plus plugin to actually work on my system.
No worries. Now we got to practice run, so next time you'll be all set.
Awesome. Great.
Thanks so much, Tim, and I'll keep in touch.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.